Hello and welcome to another episode of 1000 Actually Fun Books, where we're on a quest to find the best of escapist, just enjoyable reading books of all genres. This time we are doing Stormglass by Jeff Wheeler. I thought it might be a sci-fi, but it is definitely fantasy. A fantasy book, first in a trilogy or more, at least a series of some variety called the Hairbringer series. It takes place in a world that people who have read other Jeff Wheeler books might find somewhat familiar. It sounds like he takes some things from some of his other series in the past and kind of brings tiny little bits of it into this series. Okay, so starting with the plot. So this is a fantasy steampunk, so not a sci-fi steampunk. So all the things like the airships and the technology is all powered by magic. So it's kind of a fun twist on the sci-fi take, but it is a steampunk in that it has all the the classic tropes of what you think about that. So you do have the airships, you have Victorian dress and manners. The wealthy go to balls to spend time. There's no technology, so to speak. Everything is handled by weird mystical mysteries. All right, so the plot is about there are two threads. There are two main characters, two girls in very different situations, both about 12 years old. The first is SETI. So the society they live in is a very literal class system, not caste, class system. So the poor live low, and the upper class, the wealthy, live up high in floating manors. So very physically separating the class distinction there. This isn't this isn't an original idea. Other books have done this, but he does it pretty well with that. People down below constantly live in fear of the manors up above losing power and falling on them, which is a real danger. This isn't just like a superstition thing, and that comes into play in the book. So SETI starts out as an impoverished waif, an orphan from down below, and in surprising circumstances, she gets elevated to be, we'll say, fostered, because she's not quite adopted, but she's not quite just a guest either. Fostered by one of the most upper class of the upper class. And she's introduced into this house, and her thread, her plot line is mostly about not her integrating into this situation, and not really about her discovering things about the magical world that she's, tasting, but actually rather it's about her trying to survive the oppression of the person in charge of the manor house, not the person that is fostering her, but like the housekeeper, who is constantly, we'll say, abusing her, not physically, but in all sorts of other ways, terrorizing SETI. And so it's kind of almost her plot line is about her surviving that and then, triumphing over that. So that's kind of her plot thread. The other person's plot thread, the other main character is named Sarah, and she is a princess. So she starts out high nobility, and I wouldn't say she has a very serious plot. It's mostly an intro of this character. Like, you get to know who she is. She's not a very likable character, honestly. I guess her plot is sort of coming to terms with her being a princess and the responsibility that entails, and getting out from under, again, the kind of the oppression, or this time not of a housekeeper, but of her father, who is very evil and trying to prevent her from coming into power. Okay, so those are our two plot threads. So I consider this book a mixed bag, whether I liked it and didn't like it. It was kind of in the middle ground, because most things had both, everything that I bring up has both a kind of a good and bad to it. It's not like wholly wonderful or wholly horrible. So let's talk about first the world building. So I tend to really like world building. I love creative worlds, things like Lord of the Rings and Wizard of Oz and Books of Narnia, things where as you go along, you are discovering what creative, interesting, weird things that the author has come up with that are just completely surprising. I love that, that you can come up with, such imaginative stuff. So this book is in a creative world where there are magical mysteries afoot. Seti especially, not so much Sarah, but Seti kind of keeps stumbling upon various magical mysteries. She wonders what's going on. Sometimes it's mostly not explained though. So she, the music of the houses. So they're told that it's piped in from concerts happening down below, kind of like a radio, that's magically happening. And it turns on and off kind of, I don't know why, arbitrarily. I'm not sure how it turns on and off. And Seti at one point was able to turn on some music. But it's not explained exactly, what caused that or how that happened. It's just like, oh, she did it and didn't know what was going on and nobody explains it to her. Or I'm trying to think of another kind of world building thing. Oh, okay. So there are 4 schools of magic. There is law, which is pretty self-explanatory. War, also very self-explanatory. Thought, which they do go in and say this is the arts for the most part. And then the wind. And they don't really explain what the wind is at all. At least not until quite a ways through the book. You kind of get hints and stuff. You kind of think like, okay, my first thought was the wind, the power of the wind. Well, that's obviously keeping the ships aloft, right? Keeping the tower manners up in the air. I mean, this all seems to be like the school of the wind that does this. Okay, well, that kind of explains that. Except then you see a doctor, a medical doctor, is trained in the school of the wind. And I'm like, what? That doesn't have anything to do with keeping things up in the air. What is that? It didn't occur to me until over halfway through the book when there was more explanation about this, that, oh, the school of the wind is probably referring to the sciences. So innovation, exploration, things like that explaining the way the world works in a world with magic. So I liked that world building. I didn't like the way the author handled it though, where it just felt like constant questions that never get answered, or if they do get answered, they get answered way later in the book and very little of it. It's almost like inferred that you know something more than what is there. And this may be a case because, like I said at the beginning, the author has written other series and draws bits and pieces of it. He says in his author's note, the idea of the mysteries and the schools of magic seem to have come from another series. And so I think the author assumes you've already read that series or something, even though it's supposedly not related to this, because he doesn't go into detail explaining what's going on. It could also be that this being the first in a series, it's basically all introduction. And it kind of feels that way. It feels like it's all an introduction to the next book. Like Sarah especially, her entire story arc feels like this is the introduction of the story. It's not really the story itself. You're supposed to go to the next book to find out anything really a story arc for her. So yeah, I like world building, but I didn't really like this world building. So it was a mixed bag there. Another thing that I would say is a mixed bag was what I would say the audience should be for this book. So I found it in the adult fiction section of the library. It is classified as adult fiction on Amazon. It doesn't read like adult fiction. This is a young adult book. And this is a mixed bag for me because I like juvenile fiction, young adult fiction. I'm planning on doing several reviews of that and having a bunch on my best of list. Um, so it's not necessarily a negative, but it feels like it was written for a teenager. As in, there's a lot of shallow critical thinking, perhaps, or shallow decision making, one dimensional characters, things like that, that you can get away with in a younger book. And I would give a lot more grace to if it was meant to be a younger book. But because it's meant to be an adult fiction, I look at that and kind of go, you really should have had a little bit more nuance and depth to these characters or situations or whatever that just isn't found here. I didn't particularly like that. That can be in characters. So, for example, Sarah, her father is a very one dimensional kind of bad guy. And he is extremely bad, kind of the kind of character that would, sell his daughter to get ahead politically, kind of thing. I mean, that tells you something right there. That's the lowest of the low. And it seems like the author did that to make Sarah, his daughter, the princess, less of a horrible character, honestly, because she is a very kind of unlikable character for the most part. She starts out as very rebellious and entitled and disrespectful and self-centered. And she has a little bit of a comeuppance in the sense that there are some consequences that happen. She does a bunch of things and other people reap the consequences. And she's kind of distressed about this. She does something that she knows her father will not like. And her father finds out and does not like it. And so the person that she was conspiring with, so to speak, there was a group of them to do this naughty thing that she knew she wasn't supposed to do, they all basically had their lives ruined. And she's like, what? Blame me, father, it was all my fault. So you kind of see where she gets a consequence of that, but you don't see her personality changing to be less like that. She's just more aware that there will be consequences to her actions, but it doesn't change her core personality of being very self-entitled, disrespectful, kind of person that, high class, stick your nose up in the air, kind of person you don't like. I will read one little excerpt about her that on page 148 that kind of just describes what I said. Commander Falking strode over to them, and Sarah felt a twinge of guilt for her small act of rebellion. But as she tasted the guilt, she found it sweet. Being naughty was always a little thrilling. So that's kind of her personality. She likes to be disruptive. She likes getting a rise out of other people. She likes needling other people until they're very annoyed. And that's just the kind of person that she's been written to be. Not a very pleasant character, I don't think. Anyway, so like I said, that kind of just is that. Anyway, I was trying to get to the point of Sarah is written unpleasantly. So her father, in order to, counteract that, otherwise she would basically be this horrible person that we would never like. Well, he is even worse, so she doesn't look as bad. Which, again, that just strikes me as kind of poorly written, honestly. Like, a character should stand on their own, not be contrasted and, tried to make better by having an even worse character, right? That just, I don't know. I don't like that. But that's just me. Let's see. I'm trying to think of other things. I will say that there were some definitely good characters, likable characters. So Seti, for example, our first main character, is pretty likable as a character. She's probably the most fleshed out character in the entire book. And she isn't perfect, but she is a nice person. I will say in her character arc, not her character arc, in her storyline. I would have liked more of that disruption, I guess you could say, in how the change from poverty to total, upper class should have come across. Should have come across as more jarring, had a lot more transition, difficulty fitting in, that kind of stuff, and it just didn't bother delving into that. It kind of just ignored that. One day she's starving on the streets, the next day she's sitting prettily, as one of the family, being, learning to dance. And there doesn't seem to be any cognitive dissonance in that. It just, no problem, let's just get on with life. We can do this. And that seems a little unrealistic. So my overall impression on this is, honestly, it's just okay. It's not a bad book. I didn't love it. I think that it's kind of tropey. A lot of things you can find here you could probably find elsewhere in better books. The world building wasn't enough to make it up for the other shortfalls. It does really, really, really strongly feel like it's the introduction, it's almost the advertisement for book number 2, rather than really feeling like a fantastic book by itself. Yeah, so I don't highly recommend it, but, it's okay. So part 2. So my next book that I'm going to read and review is called Dungeon Crawler Carl by Matt Dimiman. Dimiman? I don't have it, so, here you go. It looks like it's going to be a video game book or something. I mean, it strikes me as a video game. It's supposed to be some man named Carl going through a dungeon that sounds like aliens have set up a big old video game in real life, and he has to go through it. And that sounds like a lot of fun. So that's what I'm going to try next. I hope you join me. Thank you for watching.